A black man was pulled over in Birmingham, Alabama. A white cop is ready to assert his power. What doesn't he know? The man he just stopped is the one who decides if he keeps his badge. The moment Officer Brent Calloway turned on his siren, he thought it was just another routine stop. Black male. Late model sedan. Nice suit. Suspicious. That was enough. He never asked about speeding. He never mentioned a broken light. He saw a black man in a quiet neighborhood and decided that was reason enough. What he didn't realize was this: Julian Carter wasn't just anyone. He was the Director of Internal Affairs for the Alabama State Police, and the man Calloway had just pulled over. He was the one who investigated bad cops. The sun hung low over Birmingham, stretching gold across the cracked sidewalks and red brick buildings. It was one of those southern evenings where the heat didn't let go easily, even after dark. Julian Carter sat behind the wheel of his silver sedan, heading home after a long day at the office. His jacket was off, his collar unbuttoned, jazz humming quietly from the dashboard. His eyes were sharp, calm, tired, but alert. The sirens didn't surprise him. They disappointed him. As the flashing lights filled his rear-view mirror, Julian eased the car to the curb. He knew the routine. Hazard lights on, window halfway down. Hands at 10 and 2. Officer Calloway approached, posture rigid, hand near his holster, not because of threat, but because of assumption. License and registration. Julian handed them over wordlessly, his fingers steady. Calloway glanced at the name on the license but didn't blink. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Not yet. "You from around here?" Calloway asked, already prying. Julian nodded. "Just moved to Birmingham." "The address is current." But Calloway wasn't looking for information. He was looking for confirmation. Confirmation of a story he had already written in his mind. Black man. Nice car, quiet street. It didn't add up. And when things didn't add up, Calloway made them fit by force. What he didn't see, what he refused to see, was the truth right in front of him. Julian Carter was the system he thought he controlled. And by the time he reached for his authority, he was already answering to a higher one. The leather of Officer Brent Calloway's duty belt creaked slightly as he stopped by the driver's side window. His mirrored sunglasses caught the last sliver of sunlight, reflecting nothing but a distorted image of the man inside the car, one he hadn't taken the time to truly see. Julian Carter sat quietly in the silver sedan, posture erect but relaxed, his breathing even. There was no panic in his eyes, no fumbling with buttons, no raised voice asking why. Just quiet and control. Too much control for Calloway's comfort. "License and registration," the officer said, voice clipped, tone bored, but laced with a stiffness that suggested he was already trying to reassert dominance. Julian gave a small, polite nod. "Yes, officer." His movements were slow and purposeful, like a man used to being watched, scrutinized. He reached over to the glove compartment, retrieved the registration, then took out his wallet and handed both documents through the open window. Calloway didn't thank him. He didn't even look Julian in the eye. He glanced at the license. Julian Carter, address, Birmingham, AL. Then, back to the man in front of him. Julian's shirt was crisp, the cuffs subtly embroidered. No gold chains. No cheap sunglasses. No smell of anything but faint cologne and leather upholstery. It didn't fit. None of it fit. "You didn't come to a full stop at the red light back there," Calloway said. The line was delivered with mechanical detachment. But it lacked weight. It wasn't an accusation. It was an excuse. Julian met the moment like a man used to walking into courtrooms, not out of them. "I thought I came to a complete stop," he replied, "but I understand." No sarcasm, no protest. Just a measured tone, like he was aware that arguing wouldn't help and might only escalate the situation. Julian had been here before, too many times. But this wasn't just compliance. This was precision. The kind of verbal choreography black men like Julian had to perfect to survive mundane interactions that could spiral into front-page tragedy. Calloway lingered. He didn't move, didn't walk back to his car, didn't issue a warning or a citation. He just stood there. His eyes drifted over the dashboard, then to Julian's hands, resting calmly on the wheel. No movement, no twitch, no aggression. And yet, something about Julian's stillness made him itch. "You from Birmingham originally?" he asked. Julian's answer came smoothly. "No, sir, I moved here a few months ago, work." Calloway nodded slowly, but it wasn't acknowledgement. It was a calculation. He was looking for something, anything. And the fact that Julian wasn't giving it to him was like a loose thread he couldn't stop pulling at. Calloway leaned slightly closer to the open window. "Where are you coming from tonight?" Julian turned his head slightly. His voice didn't change. "Just finished work. I'm heading home." Another answer. Another complete sentence. Another refusal to let Calloway dictate the energy. To the casual observer, this might have looked like a simple stop. Just another officer doing his job, but anyone watching closely would see something different. A battle of restraint. Calloway's hand tapped lightly on the edge of the door frame. He wasn't asking questions anymore to gather facts. He was testing reactions. Julian stayed silent. Not out of fear, but because he knew how quickly silence could turn into a mirror. And in this moment, Calloway was being forced to look at himself. "You're always this calm when you get pulled over?" the officer asked, voice tinged with a hint of irritation now. Julian allowed the barest flicker of a smile, not amused. Not sarcastic, just deliberate. "I've had some practice." Calloway's lips tightened. There it was, that sentence, that subtle defiance, not in tone, but in confidence. It unnerved him, because Officer Brent Calloway wasn't used to being spoken to by men like Julian Carter, men who didn't shrink, didn't stammer, didn't scramble to prove they weren't a threat. He was used to fear. And this wasn't fair. This was discipline. He stepped back a half step and looked at the license again. "You don't sound like you're from here either." Julian tilted his head. "Is that a problem, officer?" The question was soft, almost gentle. But it landed like a punch. Calloway straightened, adjusted his belt. "No," he said quickly, just making conversation. Julian didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because everything was already shifting. Calloway was no longer in control. Not really. Because standing in front of him was a man who had done the emotional math, weighed the risks, and still chosen calm over fear, poise over panic, dignity over deference. And that wasn't what Calloway was trained for. He was trained to recognize threats. He was trained to expect resistance. He was trained to respond to fear. But no one ever trained him for self-assured silence. Julian hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't challenged the stop. He hadn't questioned the officer's authority. But he had done something far more dangerous. He had refused to be small. And somewhere, beneath the uniform and the badge and the years of assumed power, Brent Calloway felt the ground shift ever so slightly. He didn't know why. But he knew this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. And deep down, some part of him sensed he had just pulled over the wrong man. There's a kind of silence that feels louder than shouting, That's what was settled between them now. Not the silence of cooperation, but of control being quietly, surgically dismantled. Julian Carter hadn't said much, but that was the problem. His calm was unsettling. His voice was steady. His eyes are clear. He hadn't broken once, and that unnerved Officer Brent Calloway far more than yelling ever could. Calloway didn't step back toward his cruiser. He stayed there, hovering, like a man watching a chessboard he no longer understood. The man in the car wasn't playing the part Calloway had expected. No fear. No apology, no submission, just clarity. Too much of it. Calloway's thumb grazed the corner of Julian's license again. Something didn't feel right. Not about the paperwork, about the man. It wasn't about the traffic light anymore. It wasn't even about the car. It was about the tone, the control, the confidence that didn't match the uniform Julian was wearing. Calloway had pulled over hundreds of drivers in his career, some panicked, some angry, some smug. But this one was surgical. And it was starting to get under his skin. "Where exactly are you coming from?" Calloway asked again, but this time the tone was sharper, less curious, more accusatory. Julian didn't flinch. "As I mentioned, officer, I'm heading home from work." "What kind of work do you do?" Julian paused for a beat, not long enough to be rude, but just long enough to signal he noticed the shift. "Administrative," he said simply. "Government." Calloway didn't like that. It was vague, clean, purposefully unsatisfying. "And where's home?" Julian turned his head slightly, still seated, hands still on the wheel. His voice didn't rise. It stayed cool, measured. "Same address on the license you're holding, officer." The answer wasn't disrespectful. It was exact. Too exact. Calloway's jaw tightened. He hadn't realized it, but his breathing had shifted. More shallow, shoulders higher. That creeping feeling again, the one he couldn't name but hated all the same. He was not used to this kind of encounter. He was used to people explaining themselves. Over-explaining, really. But Julian wasn't playing the game. He wasn't defending his presence on the street. He wasn't trying to prove he belonged. He wasn't begging for leniency or overcompensating with charm. He was just there, calm, still, unshaken, and it was driving Calloway off balance. With no infraction to escalate, he did what officers like him had done for generations when logic failed them. He relied on feeling. Something about this guy just didn't sit right. Something about the way he looked at him, spoke to him, as if they were equals. He wasn't used to that. Not from someone who looked like Julian. "Step out of the vehicle for me," Calloway said suddenly. The words cut through the silence like a blade. Julian didn't react right away. He blinked once, then turned his head. "Is there a specific reason for that request, officer?" It wasn't defiance. It was a question. One that forced Calloway to examine his own motives and find them, for a second, embarrassingly empty. He recovered quickly. "I asked you to step out of the vehicle. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." There it was. Not a command rooted in law, but in threat. Not about safety, about dominance. Julian exhaled slowly, his grip on the steering wheel tightening just enough for his knuckles to shift, then releasing. Without a word, he reached for the door handle. Every movement is deliberate. He stepped out into the heat of the Birmingham evening, the sunlight now casting long shadows behind them. He was taller than Calloway had expected, not physically intimidating, but grounded, rooted. Like a man who knew exactly where he stood and exactly who was trying to move him. Calloway stepped back, surprised by the sudden proximity, surprised by how composed Julian still looked. "Hands where I can see them." Julian complied instantly. Palms relaxed at his sides. "Is there something specific you're looking for, Officer Calloway?" he asked, voice calm. Calloway smirked faintly, masking discomfort behind forced authority. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here lately." Julian raised an eyebrow, almost imperceptibly. "Incidents involving men in suits driving home after work?" The question wasn't sarcastic. It was surgical. It cut through the veil of justification that Calloway had thrown up around himself. He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. The two men stood there 5 feet apart, one cloaked in a badge and uncertainty. The other was wrapped in silence and something far more threatening to Calloway. Poise. This wasn't going the way Calloway had expected. He wanted control. Instead, he got a mirror. And what he saw in Julian Carter was a man who wasn't reacting to him. He was studying him. Unshaken, unmoved, worse yet, unimpressed. And somewhere inside, Calloway knew. This stop was no longer about law enforcement. It was about ego, and he had just stepped into something he wasn't ready for. Julian stood there under the weight of a southern sun, the kind that seemed to hang too low, too heavy, like it was waiting for something to break. His hands were still visible. His stance was composed. He hadn't moved an inch since stepping out of his car, but the entire dynamic had shifted. And Officer Brent Calloway felt it. The silence between them wasn't passive anymore. It was strategic. Controlled. A mirror. And Calloway was beginning to see something in it he didn't like. Himself. He walked slowly around the front of the car, boots scraping the pavement, trying to reclaim ground he hadn't technically lost, but could feel slipping anyway. He hadn't found anything wrong with Julian. No weapons. No drugs, no aggression, just a well-dressed black man who knew exactly how to navigate power without ever raising his voice. And that, in Calloway's world, was more dangerous than a threat. "Hands where I can see them," Calloway repeated unnecessarily. Julian kept them exactly where they were. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I've got nothing to hide." Calloway's eyes narrowed. He didn't like how easily that landed. He didn't like how Julian was treating this like a negotiation, like an evaluation. And he especially didn't like that somewhere in the back of his mind, he had the sinking feeling he was the one being tested. Julian tilted his head, calm but direct. "Can I ask, officer, what exactly are you looking for?" Calloway blinked. "Excuse me?" Julian repeated it, his voice quieter but sharper. "Is it because I'm wearing a suit? Driving a silver sedan? Because I stopped at a light, you think I didn't stop completely? Or is it something else?" Calloway shifted. This wasn't how the script went. He'd been in plenty of stops where the driver was unsure, apologetic, or furious. Julian was none of those. He wasn't playing into the narrative. He was writing a new one, right there on the side of the road. Calloway scoffed, a defense mechanism more than a reaction. "We've had some reports lately. Can't be too careful." "Reports about people like me?" Julian delivered the line like a scalpel, not to wound, but to expose. Calloway's face twitched. "I didn't say that." "No," Julian replied, "but you were about to." Calloway straightened. His hand instinctively brushed against his belt. Again, not for defense, but for grounding. His power was slipping, and he knew it. He tried to recover. "You seem real familiar with how this works." Julian's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "I've had experience." Calloway nodded, muttering under his breath. "Yeah, People like you always. And then he stopped himself. Too late. Julian froze, not with shock, but with clarity. People like me? He asked softly. Calloway's mouth opened, then closed. What exactly are people like me, officer? The question sat between them like a live wire. And for the first time, Calloway didn't have an answer. Not one he could say out loud. Not one that wouldn't confirm everything he'd just tried to deny. I didn't mean it like that, he stammered. Julian took a step forward, not aggressive, just present. You sure? Calloway looked away, then back again. You're twisting my words. No, Julian replied. I'm just repeating them, and for the record, it's not the words that matter most. It's what made you reach for them in the first place. Calloway's face was red now, not from heat, but from exposure. He'd crossed a line and he knew it. But more than that, he'd done it with someone who knew exactly how lines are documented, how they're written down, how they're investigated, how they're punished. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He let the silence do the heavy lifting. Because it wasn't the volume that mattered, it was the truth underneath it all. You've been looking for something to pin on me, Julian said, since the moment you saw who was behind the wheel. Not because I ran a red light, not because I posed a threat, but because something about me didn't fit your story. Calloway didn't respond. He couldn't. Julian's voice dropped, still calm, but the kind of calm that makes people flinch. And the problem, officer, is that you made that story up the second you saw my skin. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be, because truth has a way of echoing without volume. Calloway stepped back, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. Not physically, but ethically. He'd played this scene before. Hundreds of times. But never like this. Never with someone who knew the terrain better than he did. Julian's next words were measured, almost weary. You know, I've had this conversation too many times. Different officers. Different cities. Same uniform, same posture. Same doubt in your eyes when the assumptions start to crack. He let the moment hang, then delivered the final cut. But here's the difference this time. I'm not just another man on the side of the road. Calloway swallowed hard. His hand dropped fully away from his belt now. The realization had begun to settle. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. And something deep inside him, something instinctive, began to whisper. You messed with the wrong one. Julian didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because sometimes the sharpest blade is quiet. And Officer Brent Calloway had just cut himself. The words had barely left his mouth. People like you. Before he realized they were soaked in something he couldn't wipe off. Bias. Raw and unfiltered. Julian's tone didn't change. What were you going to say, officer? He asked, eyes steady. What is a person like me? Calloway blinked and took a step back as if trying to rewind time by sheer force of will. I didn't mean... But you did, Julian cut in, not cruelly, but with precision. You didn't say it out of anger. You said it because it was already in you. The silence afterward was heavier than any siren. And this time, it wasn't Julian who looked under pressure. It was Calloway. He shifted his weight, his fingers tapping against the edge of his duty belt. Not nervous, not yet, but disoriented, like someone who just realized the rules of the game had changed and he wasn't holding the winning hand. Julian took a slow breath, never breaking eye contact. You see a black man in a suit, driving a decent car. Calm, polite, educated. And it makes you uncomfortable. That's not fair, Calloway snapped, more out of defense than conviction. "No," Julian replied. "What's not fair is being followed, pulled over and interrogated for simply not matching your expectations of what safety looks like." The officer's mouth opened to respond, but Julian raised a hand, not aggressively, just firmly, as if saying, "You've said enough." "This entire stop hasn't been about traffic law," he continued. "It's been about discomfort, yours. You couldn't reconcile what you saw. So you started reaching for anything to justify your suspicion." Calloway swallowed hard. "Let me ask you something," Julian said, stepping forward just a little enough to collapse the illusion that he should be on the defensive. "If I were white, in this same car, dressed the same, speaking the same, would we be having this conversation?" Calloway looked down. "Exactly." Julian took another step forward. Measured. Still calm. "You've asked me a lot of questions, Officer Calloway. Let me answer one you haven't asked yet, one you're too afraid to." He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. His hand moved with such deliberate control that Calloway instinctively tensed, then stopped himself. "No need for theatrics," Julian said, eyes locked onto the officer's. "But you should see this." He pulled out a slim, black leather wallet. Flipped it open. The sun caught the badge before Calloway's brain could. Julian Carter. Director of Internal Affairs, Alabama Department of Public Safety. Calloway's eyes went wide. He took a visible half-step back. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Julian's voice stayed even, almost gentle. "You've just conducted an unlawful escalation on the man who oversees officer conduct for the entire state." The words didn't shout, they landed. And for the first time since he stepped out of the cruiser, Brent Calloway was silent. He looked at the badge again, then up at Julian's face. But the expression waiting for him wasn't anger. It wasn't smugness. It was a disappointment, a weight far heavier to carry. "I've seen your type before," Julian said. "Not the uniform, the mindset. The ones who think the badge is a shield from consequence, not a promise to serve with integrity." Calloway opened his mouth again, desperate now. I didn't know." "Exactly," Julian interrupted, voice sharper. "You didn't know. And yet you proceeded with suspicion, with dominance, with threats. You acted on assumptions, not facts. On prejudice, not law." He let that hang, then added, almost as a whisper, "And if this is how you treat a man like me, imagine how you treat those without a title." Calloway's face was pale now. The wind had shifted, and he knew it. His hand, once firm on his belt, now hovered uselessly at his side. Julian didn't move. Didn't smirk. He simply let the moment settle. "You have two options right now," he said. "You can return my documents, or you can keep pushing this and make a mistake you won't recover from." Calloway didn't answer right away. His hands shook just slightly as he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Julian's license and registration. He handed them back without a word. Julian tucked them into his wallet. His voice now was low, but it hit like a courtroom verdict. "You'll be hearing from me again, not as the man you pulled over, but as the one deciding whether you should wear that badge next month." Calloway froze. Julian turned and stepped back toward the driver's side door, then paused. One last look over his shoulder. "Remember this, Officer Calloway. The badge doesn't make you powerful, it makes you accountable." Then he slid into his car, started the engine. Left the officer standing there, no longer in control, no longer certain, just exposed. And this time, it would be in the report. For a few long seconds, Officer Brent Calloway didn't move. His fingertips brushed the edges of the license and registration like they were burning through his gloves. A minute ago, he was barking orders. Now, his fingers were trembling, and his heartbeat was so loud he could hear it pulsing behind his ears. Across from him, Julian Carter stood like a verdict delivered in flesh and bone. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have backup. What he had was worse for Calloway. He had authority, and he had witnessed everything. Julian didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or lean into the moment the way a lesser man might have. Instead, he just stood there, silent, measured, and devastatingly in control. "I'm not just a driver," Julian said, his voice sharp enough to split pavement. "I'm the judge of whether you deserve to wear that uniform." The words didn't land like an insult. They landed like a fact. Calloway's breath caught in his throat. He tried to recover, somehow. Maybe an apology. Maybe a plea. But his voice had abandoned him, and the weight of his own decision sat too heavy on his tongue. Julian didn't flinch. He just watched as Calloway hesitated, then finally reached into his chest pocket and pulled out the papers. They shook. He hated that they shook. He held them out like a white flag, silent, pathetic. Julian took them without comment, slid them into his wallet, straightened his jacket. Then he turned. He walked slowly toward the driver's side door, each step measured like punctuation at the end of a long, damning sentence. But before he got in, he paused. He turned his head, just enough for Calloway to see him, but not enough to offer comfort, just clarity. And then came the last line, the one that would echo long after the engine turned over. "The badge doesn't make you superior to anyone else," Julian said, voice low but thunderous. "It makes you accountable to everyone." It was the kind of statement that didn't ask for a reaction. It simply was. And then Julian slid into the car, pulled the door shut with finality, and turned the key. The engine hummed back to life. Calm. Controlled, just like the man behind the wheel. And just like that, he pulled away. Left Calloway standing on the side of that quiet Birmingham street, his uniform suddenly feeling heavier, tighter, less like armor and more like a question mark. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't log the stop. He just stood there, staring at nothing, because for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one watching. He was the one being watched. And he knew it. Inside the car, Julian gripped the wheel, gaze locked on the horizon. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry, but his mind was moving faster than traffic. This wasn't a personal victory. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was evidence. It was a pattern. It was the system revealing itself in daylight. He'd encountered men like Calloway before, men whose power came not from principle, but from the silence that surrounded them. Only this time, silence wouldn't protect him. This time, Julian would make sure the silence spoke. Because what Calloway didn't know, what he never even stopped to consider, was that internal affairs doesn't just observe. It reforms, and this was going on the record. The street faded behind him. The city continued as if nothing had happened, but something had. In a neighborhood where everyone was used to pretending the system worked just fine, a crack had formed. It started with a traffic stop. It ended with a warning. A quiet man in a silver sedan had looked at a uniform, saw the abuse behind the badge, and spoke for everyone who had been too scared, too tired, or too broken to do it themselves. Julian wasn't just confronting Calloway. He was confronting a culture. And while Calloway had walked away humiliated, Julian was just getting started. The next morning, the sun rose clean and indifferent over downtown Birmingham, cutting through the windows of the Alabama Department of Public Safety's Internal Affairs Division. But inside the office, the light didn't feel warm. It felt surgical. Julian Carter sat behind a thick oak desk, his back straight, eyes focused. The city was already moving outside, buses rumbling, school bells chiming in the distance. But here, everything was still. On his desk, a slim manila folder. Stamped across the tab in faded black ink, Calloway, Brent. Julian didn't open it right away. He already knew what was inside. He'd seen this file before. What changed now was the context. What changed was last night. Julian exhaled slowly, placed both hands on the table, and flipped the folder open. The first page was a summary sheet, basic data. Age, years of service, commendations. It read like the resume of a solid street officer. But Julian wasn't interested in the front page. He turned to the back. That's where the real story lived. Internal notes. Officer Brent Calloway. May 2018, complaint filed for excessive force during a traffic stop. Resolved internally. August 2019, accusation of racial profiling. No disciplinary action taken. November 2020, civilian claim of verbal intimidation, labeled unsubstantiated. February 2022, formal concern by junior officer regarding aggressive conduct. Closed after informal review. 4 complaints, 4 disappearances. No suspensions, no retraining, no transparency. Julian closed the file, not with frustration but with something colder. Resolution. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Linda," he said calmly, "can you get Chief Lowell on the line? I need a face-to-face." "Today?" There was a pause, then, "Yes, Mr. Carter." "She's in her office now. I'll schedule you in. Make it within the hour." Julian didn't wait for confirmation. 50 minutes later, he stood in the glass-walled conference room of the Birmingham Police Department headquarters, staring at a wall of service plaques and framed commendations. A symbol of everything that looked like order. Across from him sat Chief Marissa Lowell, a seasoned leader in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair, her uniform immaculate, and her tone all business. She'd survived 5 administrations, 2 federal audits, and 3 internal shakeups. She wasn't easily rattled, which is why the opening line she chose carried weight. This isn't the first time his name has come up in investigations. Julian nodded, arms folded, still standing. "I know," he said, "but it may be the first time someone in uniform actually did something about it." Chief Lowell leaned back, studying him. "I'm not here for press releases, Marissa," Julian continued. "I'm here because your department has let a man walk around with a badge and unchecked bias for 5 years. Lowell didn't flinch. "We followed protocol." "No," Julian replied sharply. "You followed habit. Protocol is what you lean on when you want to avoid accountability, but still sleep at night." She raised an eyebrow. "You're implying we've been negligent." "I'm not implying anything," he said. "I experienced it firsthand." There was a pause. A subtle one, the kind that happens when 2 people in power are trying to read each other without showing their hand. Lowell finally gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit," she said, not a request, a challenge. Julian did. "The stop," she said. "Tell me everything." And he did. He didn't dramatize it, didn't embellish. He walked her through each step, Calloway's tone, his line of questioning, the manufactured justification, the thinly veiled insult, the moment of exposure. And finally, the part that concerned her most, the badge, the authority, the fact that Julian Carter, the man responsible for overseeing the conduct of Alabama's police force, had been profiled by a cop who didn't even pause long enough to read the name on a license. When Julian finished, the room went still. Lowell tapped a pen against the folder in front of her. It was thin. Too thin. "How far do you plan to take this?" she asked quietly. "As far as it needs to go," Julian said. "And I'm not just talking about Officer Calloway." Lowell blinked. "You want a department-wide review?" "I want a department-wide reckoning," he said. And then, with measured precision, "I want to know why 4 separate complaints didn't result in retraining, disciplinary action, or public accountability. I want to know how many more Calloways are walking around with a badge and how blessed this building is. And I want to know what you're going to do now that one of those encounters went on the record, with me on the receiving end." Lowell sighed, not out of exhaustion, but awareness. She knew what this meant. This wasn't just about one man's behavior, it was about her command. "I'll need time," she said finally. "You don't have time," Julian countered. "You have history. And it's already catching up to you." He stood. The meeting wasn't angry. It wasn't chaotic. But it was decisive. As he gathered his folder and turned toward the door, Lowell spoke once more. "Julian." He turned back. "I'll cooperate," she said, "but this will rattle more than a few cages." Julian nodded. "Good. Some cages need shaking. Some need to be torn down." And with that, he walked out. Back in his office, Julian sat down slowly. The folder was still in his hand, but now it wasn't just a document, it was a signal. A man in a suit had been pulled over for not fitting the story in a white officer's head. Now the story was about to change, and he would be the one holding the pen. The walls of the Internal Affairs conference room in downtown Birmingham had heard countless excuses, countless denials, countless "we'll do better next time." But this morning, the silence inside wasn't protective. It was a prelude. Julian Carter stood at the head of the long, polished oak table, a stack of reports fanned out before him. 12 people sat across from him, senior investigators, department analysts, community liaisons, and 2 city officials whose presence meant the stakes had risen well above departmental optics. On the whiteboard behind Julian were 3 simple words written in dark blue marker: training, accountability, culture. No one had spoken in nearly a minute. The air was thick, uncomfortable. Julian finally broke the silence, his voice low but resonant. "We cannot continue to be silent," he said, "because silence in this system doesn't mean peace." He paused. "It means tolerance." A few heads shifted. One man glanced down at his notepad, another scratched his chin. Julian's gaze moved across the room like a spotlight. "Officer Brent Calloway is not an isolated incident," he said. "He's a product, a symptom of what we've allowed to fester by pretending internal resolution is the same as accountability." He tapped the file with the back of his hand. 4 complaints, no transparency, no corrective action, and let's be honest, we only reopened the conversation because it happened to me. No one argued. Julian took a breath and delivered the proposal he'd been refining since dawn. "I'm initiating a comprehensive departmental review, not just of personnel, not just disciplinary files. We're going all the way to the bones." He walked toward the board and underlined the first word: training. "We'll audit what's being taught in every academy course and supplemental workshop. I want bias response modules rewritten from scratch, with community oversight." A few pens began scribbling. The room was waking up. Accountability. "We will install a permanent civilian review panel with subpoena power. Every misconduct claim, no matter how small, goes through them. No more self-policing. Julian turned and locked eyes with the senior department analyst. And I want quarterly audits made public. The man swallowed but nodded. Julian moved to the last word. Culture. This is the hardest one, he said. Because culture doesn't change with rules. It changes with exposure, with shame, and with truth. He gestured toward the window, toward the city. That's why we're launching a series of public forums, face-to-face, department-led conversations with residents. We're not just going to talk to them. We're going to listen. I want real data, community trust surveys, feedback sessions, and recorded testimony. He paused, then delivered the line that turned the meeting from administrative to historic. If our system can't withstand the voices of the people we serve, it doesn't deserve to exist in its current form. The room was utterly still. Not stunned, not skeptical, just still, like a tide pulling back before something larger surged forward. One of the senior investigators, a black woman named Valerie Gaines who had served 20 years in the department, finally spoke. "You're going to get pushback," she said. "From unions, from the mayor's office, from inside." Julian nodded. "Good. That means it's working." She smirked slightly. "You're going to be called dramatic, political, dangerous." "I've been called worse," he said, "and I've been silent longer than I should have." A new voice chimed in, this time from City Legal Counsel. "You realize this could bring lawsuits? Public outrage." Julian didn't flinch. "It might also bring healing." There was a silence again, but this one felt different. It felt earned. Because no one in that room, no matter how long they'd worn the badge or carried the burden of reform, had ever seen one of their own stand up and demand a reckoning, and mean it. The next 3 weeks in Birmingham moved like a second storm season. A notice went out to every precinct, mandatory training reviews, internal audits pending. Officers are to cooperate with survey teams and evaluation monitors. Resistance will be documented. Civilian volunteers were sworn in for the new oversight board. Within 72 hours, 112 misconduct cases, previously buried in closed-door archives, were being re-reviewed. Julian himself stood in gymnasiums, churches, and community centers across the city. He didn't arrive with press crews or pre-cleared talking points. He stood without a podium in shirt sleeves and rolled cuffs and opened each meeting the same way. "Tell me what the badge looks like from your side of the street." And people did. Mothers, barbers, teachers, store clerks, Vietnam vets, students, former felons. They told stories that didn't make the evening news. They described humiliation, fear, rage, and exhaustion, not from crime, but from enforcement. They told Julian about traffic stops where guns were drawn before names were asked, about questions that turned into searches, about tone, about glare, about the 1,000 small ways a badge could become a threat. And Julian wrote it all down, every word, because unlike the officers who had brushed them off before, he wasn't collecting stories. He was building the indictment. In one session, a woman in her 60s stood up and said, "You're the first man in a suit who ever asked me to speak like my pain mattered. I hope they listen to you. But if they don't, you come back. We'll speak again." Julian didn't promise justice. He promised persistence. Because what Officer Brent Calloway had started on the side of that Birmingham road, it was becoming a citywide confession. The auditorium was packed, not with reporters or officials, not with press badges or political handlers. It was packed with people, elders who'd lived through the fire hoses of the 60s, mothers with toddlers in strollers hoping for a safer future, teenagers in hoodies, veterans with canes, teachers, clergy, small business owners. No one was here for drama. They came for something far rarer: accountability. At the front of the room, beneath the dimmed lights and muted hum of overhead fans, a single podium stood on a modest wooden stage. The seal of the Alabama Department of Public Safety was fixed to its front, clean, polished, unflinching. Julian Carter stepped up behind it. No notes, no teleprompter. Just a heart that had been tested and a voice that now refused to shake. He looked out at the rows of faces, some hopeful, some tired, all listening. He adjusted the microphone. Then he began. "I've been called a lot of things in the past few weeks," he said, letting the words settle. A troublemaker, a whistleblower, a disruptor. He paused. "But I'm none of those. I'm a man who was pulled over because someone saw my skin before they saw my humanity." The room went quiet. Some said I should have let it go. After all, no one was hurt. No one got arrested. I made it home. Julian nodded slowly. "But that's the problem, isn't it?" He leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping, not in volume, but in gravity. "Because so many don't." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "And even when we do," he continued, "we carry something back with us. The knowledge that our presence was enough to be seen as a threat, that our dignity had to be earned, while others are granted it by default." Julian's eyes swept the crowd, not just seeing them, but meeting them. "This wasn't just a case," he said. "It was a mirror." He gestured to the badge pinned to his chest. "Justice," he said, "is not just about punishing evil. It's about making sure that those who wear the uniform live up to their oath." A single clap broke the silence, then another, then many. But Julian raised his hand gently, and the room fell still again. "I want to speak to those of you who've been stopped for no reason, who've had to teach your children what to do when, not if, they're pulled over. Who've been told your anger is too loud, your fear is too fragile, your truth is too much to handle." He inhaled deeply. "I hear you." A woman in the third row wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Julian's voice steadied, but his tone became more intimate, more urgent. "I'm not standing here today because I'm special. I'm standing here because I'm lucky, because I had a title that forced someone to back down." He let the silence return. "And that's exactly why this fight matters." He leaned closer to the mic, as if passing a message down a generational line. "Until we build a system where your lack of power doesn't mean a lack of protection, we haven't done our job." A thunder of applause erupted, but again Julian raised his hand. Because he wasn't done. He didn't want fanfare, he wanted to focus. "Tonight isn't the end," he said. "It's the starting point. We have hearings scheduled. Department reforms are in motion. A review board with the power to change outcomes, not just file paperwork." He took one last look across the room, then delivered the line that would echo far beyond those four walls. "The badge is not a weapon. It is a promise, and from this point forward, it will be treated like one." He stepped back. The applause was loud this time, not polite, not performative. It was the sound of people recognizing courage that doesn't wear armor, only conviction. As Julian walked off the stage, all eyes followed him, not because of his rank, not because of his badge, but because he had stood in silence and then chosen to speak, because he had been tested and acted, and because in a country where so many are watched for the wrong reasons, tonight, people watched him for the right ones. If you see yourself in this story, don't stay silent. Share it. Speak it. Let it breathe. The change we're waiting for won't begin with policies. It begins with one person refusing to look away. Start the conversation your community needs to have, because silence is never neutral. It's a decision.